morning, everyone. This is Kiersten reporting live from the newsroom. Today is October 7th. We have lots of news to report today.
I'm Lila Brown. Recently, the Stanford Prison Experiment was released, and we're here to report what happened and how Zimbardo might lose his psychology license.
The Stanford Prison Experiment was thought to be non-harmful at first. The participants volunteered, and they were paid approximately $15 a day. The roles were randomly assigned to 24 college boys, half of them being prisoners and half of them being guards.
The assigned prisoners were arrested in their homes, and the arresting process was very accurate to the real-life jail processes. They were blindfolded and then taken to the basement of the psychology department. Here they were stripped down from their clothes, assigned to a number which they could only be called by. They put them in dresses and covered up their hair. These steps took away their humanism as well as their masculinity, which transformed them into their roles.
It didn't take long before the power of role-playing and authority took place. Within hours of the experiment, guards started harassing the prisoners by waking them up in the night and calling them for count. The guards mostly used a method of compliance called foot in the door. They started off by familiarizing the prisoners with their numbers and regularly enforcing control over the prisoners. When the prisoners didn't comply with the guards, there were consequences, and the prisoners strictly began following the prison rules in order to avoid terrible treatment by the guards.
As the experiment went on, the guards and the prisoners fell deeper and deeper into their roles until they came to believe that the prisoner was actually real. Zimbardo, the psychologist in charge of the experiment, fell victim to de-individuation when he became so fascinated by the outcome of this experiment that he lost his self-awareness by disregarding the cruel treatments of the prisoners and not realizing the horrifying display until a fellow psychologist convinced him after it had gone way too far. Some may say his behavior in the experiment was his disposition, but others believe he lost himself based on the situation, since he was playing the role of the prison superintendent as well as the experiment facilitator. This is called the fundamental attribution error.
On the second day of the experiment is when the prisoners were getting frustrated with the guards. This is when group polarization started. The prisoners began to discuss revolting, and with the amount of frustration and tiredness they were feeling, their inclinations were greatly enhanced. They took off their identification numbers and barricaded their own rooms so the guards couldn't get to them. The guards reacted by spraying them with a fire extinguisher, breaking into the cells, and stripping them naked.
The guards saw themselves as the in-group and the prisoners as the out-group. They shared a common identity through their assigned roles and felt that they were better than the prisoners. The guards, again falling heavily into their roles, secretly discriminated against the prisoners by using their power to control the prisoners and forcing them to do terrible things.
The parents then visited and saw the unsanitary state of the jail. They worried about their children, and some tried to insist to take them home. However, they did not want to take them, so when they heard the plan of mass escape, the guards made the prisoners clean their cells, even scrubbed the toilets with their bare hands.
On a last note, the Stanford Prison Experiment displays something called the mirror image perception. The guards thought they were doing right by their jobs of keeping the prisoners in line, while the prisoners felt that the guards were taking the experiment way too seriously.
Next up, we have the Stanley Milgram shock experiment that occurred in 1963, which began to test how far a person would go in obeying an instructor if it involved harming another person. Similar to the Stanford Prison Experiment, roles were assigned to two people, one as the learner, who was an actor, and one who was the teacher, who was the actual subject. The participants will fall into their roles, and the teacher would adopt the attitude that they weren't doing anything wrong because they had permission from a higher authority.
The teacher would ask the learner a question. If the learner did not answer correctly, the experiment instructor would tell the teacher to administer an electric shock on the learner, which was actually fake, and the learner would act like he was being shocked. With each question incorrectly answered, a higher voltage of shock would be administered.
In order for the instructor to get the teacher to comply to its instructions of administering a shock, the method of compliance called foot in the door was used, just like in the Stanford Prison Experiment. The instructor used this by starting off ordering a small shock on the learner. After doing it a couple times, the teacher got more comfortable with obeying the instruction orders, so when the shocks began to get stronger and stronger, the teacher was more likely to comply.
This experiment is an example of cognitive dissonance. The teacher who was administering the electric shocks most likely knew very well that they were hurting another person, but at the same time, that they knew that they must follow the authority of the instructor. Those who continued to obey had reduced the cognitive dissonance by changing their attitude to comply with their behavior of administering the shocks.
The teachers in the experiment conformed by informative influence, where they believed that people in charge of the experiment were experts and they felt obligated to follow their instructions. They are also influenced by something called social inhibition, which can apply to the situation, and then at first some teachers were unsure if they could shock the learner, which shows behavior in which is more ethical. But in the presence of the instructor, that good behavior got worse and they began to obey him.
Unlike the prison experiment and the Jonestown Massacre, which we'll talk about in a little while, the shock experiment did not follow the standards for the bystander effect, since there was not multiple bystanders in the situation, therefore not giving the opportunity for someone to step up and end the unethical experiment. In other news, the Solomon Ashline experiment was a psych evaluation with 7 actors that had scripted roles in what their actions would do in one main participant. The objective of this experiment was to determine if the participant would conform to what the majority of the people were doing, if it would influence his or her choice.
Ash used a laboratory to conduct this experiment and asked male college students to come in and determine which line sequence was correct. However, all but one of the participants already knew what the experiment was about and were scripted in what to say. The actual participant was asked last and see if his answer would change in the presence of others. This is where social facilitation took place.
In this experiment, conformity by normative influence was mainly used because the facilitators wanted the participant to conform in order to fit in with the other people. In relation to the Stanford prison experiment, conformity was also displayed among the participants. Most likely, most of the prisoners were conforming based on normative influence so that they would fit in with other prisoners.
After the experiment was conducted, the results were surprising. Over the period of 12 trials, 75% of the participants at least conformed once. When interviewed after the experiment, the participants had a feeling that the answer that the other participants was wrong, but to prevent being singled out in a group situation, they gave the answer anyways. On the other hand, though, some people doubted themselves and assumed that since all the people were getting the same answer, that they might be smarter. This is conformity based on influence.
To sum up news for tonight, the Jonestown Cult Massacre occurred in late November of 1978. Hundreds of members of People's Temple in Jonestown, including men, women, and children, were directed by Reverend Jim Jones, who drank a poison-laced juice to commit a mass suicide in relation to their beliefs.
Jones used multiple methods of compliance to get his followers to obey. For starters, he used integration and, more specifically, opinion conformity. The members of the People's Temple truly believed in Jones' message of social equality and racial justice, which allowed Jones to convince them of his opinion.
He also used the method of compliance called foot in the door, which happened to be used by guards in Zimbardo's prison experiment as well, by beginning with a modest request of performing mass suicide rehearsals to test the people's faith in Jones. Having regular rehearsals of this eventually led up to the final ritual, which made it easier for people to go through with the real thing.
Compared to the Stanley Milgram shock experiment and the Stanford experiment, the theory of cognitive dissonance is also explained, and that people who were initiated into the cult were met by a positive group, which justified their decision to commit themselves to Jones. These members soon discovered that Jones isolated the town from the rest of the world, and that Jones and his message was great in order to conform with the behavior.
The reasons these people conformed to Jones, as confirmed in Ash's conformity experiment, was through both informational and normative social influence. By means of informational influence, the members of the congregation followed Jones because they believed in his message and respected his leadership, which gave them reason to conform to his authority. Normative influence also explained why they conformed because the people feared severe punishment like brutal beatings and public humiliation, which could be received for committing even the smallest of crimes.
Like the groups in the prison experiment, Jonestown would also refer themselves as the in-group and the rest of the world as the out-group. Jonestown, as in the in-group, means that the people involved will share a common identity different to the out-group mainstream society. Jones made a point to isolate Jonestown to preserve the ideas that are shared in the town and only those ideas.
Groupthink is the type of group influence that involves a desire for harmony in decision-making overriding a realistic solution. Members believed in Jones's movement, so they followed him everywhere he went, across the country to California and overseas to Guyana, with no hesitation or fear of consequences. Their belief was so strong that it completely clouded their judgment. They should have spoken up and questioned Jones's authority or gotten a non-biased opinion from the outgroup.
For those of you who don't know, there's something called the bystander effect, which is a tendency for any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are present. After the mass suicide, we asked a few survivors why they didn't do anything to stop the horrible act. One survivor reported with the one word, agony. We believe that the site of the event had such powerful negative impact on the people. We believe that the site of the event had such a powerful negative impact on the people that they could mentally not think to do anything. Another survivor said that she went in with the best of intentions, and over time she became a part of the problem because she did not speak up.
It is uncertain whether the bystander effect takes place here, but we know for certain that the event was far too unbearable to think rationally.
Our last evaluation of the Jonestown Massacre involves mirror image perceptions, which was apparent in the prison experiment. Jones thought his final ritual of mass suicide was peaceful and ethical for the reason to unite his followers in the afterlife. On the other hand, the outside world viewed it as evil and was unquestionably deemed a murder of 909 people.
That's it for today's news. We'll see you next week. I'm Lila Brown.
And I'm Kiersten Ash. Have a wonderful night.
Oh, it's gone. Okay. Okay. That was really scary. Let me tell this one.
But I just totally butchered that sentence. Oh, Tifa. I'm not Lila Brown. In our main star for the evening, Coco Ash.